Imagine standing on a quiet field in Massachusetts, dawn just breaking, when suddenly a single gunshot shatters the silence. That moment, later called the shot heard round the world, did more than ignite a skirmish. It sparked a revolution that would topple an empire and give birth to a new nation. But here's the twist. In the beginning, no one believed the colonists could win. They were farmers, merchants, and ordinary people taking on the mightiest army on earth. So how did this unlikely struggle turn into one of the most world-changing victories in history? Let's rewind and uncover how rising tensions, shocking battles, and daring gambles transformed rebellion into revolution. Rising tensions. Long before the first musket fired, the road to revolution was already being paved with resentment. Britain, drowning in debt from wars in Europe, looked to its colonies as a convenient piggy bank. The Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765 weren't just taxes. They were seen as blatant power grabs. Newspapers, playing cards, even legal documents were suddenly taxed by a government thousands of miles away. The colonists weren't just angry about money. They were furious about principle. Their cry, "No taxation without representation," wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was a direct challenge to British authority. Tensions only grew. In 1770, the Boston Massacre left 5 colonists dead after British soldiers opened fire on a hostile crowd. 3 years later, the Boston Tea Party sent shockwaves across the empire, with colonists dumping an entire shipment of tea into the harbor in defiance of Britain's Tea Act. The response? Brutal. Parliament cracked down hard, closing Boston Harbor and imposing what became known as the Intolerable Acts. To many colonists, this was no longer about taxes. It was about survival and freedom, and the spark was about to ignite into open war. First shots, fired by the spring of 1775. Tensions had boiled over. The British weren't just taxing the colonies anymore. They were marching to disarm them. On the night of April 18th, red-coated troops slipped out of Boston, aiming to seize hidden weapons in Concord, Massachusetts. But word spread faster than their march. Writers like Paul Revere carried the alarm through the night, warning towns that the British were coming. At dawn on April 19th, the two sides finally met at Lexington Green. Just a few dozen colonial militia, ordinary farmers and tradesmen, stood in the path of hundreds of British soldiers. No one knows who fired the first shot, but when the smoke cleared, the war had begun. That single exchange of gunfire would be remembered as the shot heard round the world. What followed was chaos. The British pressed on to Concord, but faced fierce resistance. As they retreated back toward Boston, colonial militias lined the roads, firing from trees and stone walls, turning the march into a blood-soaked gauntlet. In just one day, a rebellion had exploded into a revolution. Declaration of Independence. After the first shots, there was no turning back. The colonies knew they needed more than scattered militias. They needed an army. In June 1775, the Continental Congress formed the Continental Army and placed a tall Virginian named George Washington in command. That same month, blood ran on the slopes of Bunker Hill. The British technically won, but at a terrible cost. Hundreds of their soldiers lay dead or wounded. For the colonists, it proved one thing: the empire wasn't invincible. Still, victory was far from guaranteed. Through the harsh winter of 1775, American forces struggled with shortages and setbacks. Yet as Britain prepared to crush the rebellion, the colonists' determination only hardened. By the summer of 1776, the demand for full independence was unstoppable. On July 4th, the Continental Congress adopted a bold declaration, written largely by Thomas Jefferson. It wasn't just a statement of separation. It was a revolutionary idea that governments exist to serve the people, not the other way around. But Britain wasn't going to let go quietly. That same year, they unleashed one of the largest fleets ever seen in North America, determined to smash the rebellion in New York. And for Washington's untested army, the real fight was just beginning. Early struggles and surprise victories. The summer of 1776 quickly turned brutal. In New York, British forces landed by the tens of thousands, their warships lining the harbor like an iron wall. Washington's inexperienced army was no match. Defeated at Long Island and driven from the city, the rebels were forced into retreat after retreat. By winter, morale was crumbling. Soldiers deserted, supplies vanished, and many wondered if the revolution was already over. Washington himself faced whispers that he was unfit to lead. But then came a daring gamble. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington led a dangerous crossing of the icy Delaware River. At dawn, his army stormed the unsuspecting Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. Days later, he struck again at Princeton. The victories were small in scale but massive in impact. Suddenly, the colonists had proof the British could be beaten. What had looked like the dying embers of rebellion flared back into a fire of hope. Still, the struggle ahead would demand more than courage. The revolution needed a turning point, and it was about to arrive. The turning point, Saratoga. By 1777, the British believed they had the perfect plan to crush the rebellion. The idea was simple: march down from Canada, link up with forces from New York, and split New England off from the rest of the colonies. Without its fiery heart, they thought, the revolution would collapse. General John Burgoyne led the push south. At first, his progress seemed unstoppable, but the wilderness slowed his army. Supply lines stretched thin, and the colonists fought back with hit-and-run tactics that drained his strength. Finally, near Saratoga in upstate New York, Burgoyne's army collided with American forces. The battles at Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights were fierce, and against all odds, the colonists forced the British to surrender on October 17, 1777. This was more than just a battlefield victory. It was proof to the world that the Americans could stand toe-to-toe with Britain. And one nation had been watching closely: France. Until then, the French had secretly funneled supplies to the rebels, but after Saratoga, they made it official. In early 1778, France openly entered the war, bringing ships, soldiers, and money. The American Revolution had transformed from a colonial uprising into a global conflict. Stalemate in the north, battles in the south. After Saratoga, the war shifted gears. With France officially joining the fight in 1778, the Americans gained supplies, troops, and warships. At Valley Forge, Washington's battered army endured a brutal winter, but with French training, those ragged farmers were slowly forged into a professional force. Yet victory didn't come easily. In the north, battles like Monmouth in 1778 ended in stalemates. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow, so Britain turned its gaze south, hoping to rally loyalist support and choke off the rebellion there. At first, the British made alarming progress. They seized Savannah in 1779 and captured Charleston in 1780, a devastating blow to the Americans. But the South also birthed some of the Revolution's fiercest resistance. Militias used guerrilla tactics, ambushing supply lines, striking, and vanishing into the countryside, and the tide began to turn. At Kings Mountain in late 1780, American frontiersmen crushed a key British force. Just months later at Copens in January 1781, General Daniel Morgan's clever tactics humiliated the British once again. The message was clear: the empire was bleeding on all fronts, and soon the final showdown was coming. The final blow, Yorktown. By 1781, the revolution had dragged on for 6 grueling years. Both sides were exhausted, but the British still held key cities and hoped to break American resistance. General Cornwallis marched his army into Yorktown, Virginia, a decision that would seal his fate. What he didn't know was that Washington and his French allies were already setting the trap. Washington led his troops south in secret, while General Rochambeau and the French fleet moved into position. By the time Cornwallis realized what was happening, it was too late. Nearly 14,000 American and French soldiers surrounded Yorktown by land. Offshore, 36 French warships cut off British escape by sea. Trapped, bombarded, and hopelessly outnumbered, Cornwallis's army crumbled under the pressure. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his entire force. The victory stunned the world. The war wasn't officially over yet, but the British will to fight had collapsed. For all practical purposes, the revolution had been won. Aftermath and legacy. Even after Yorktown, the British still had soldiers stationed in places like Charleston and Savannah, but the fight was essentially over. Negotiations dragged on for months until on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. At last, Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. The impact of this victory stretched far beyond the 13 colonies. For the first time, a nation had broken free from the grip of a monarchy and built a government founded on democracy and the rights of its people. The world was watching, and the revolution lit sparks elsewhere, from France's storming of the Bastille to movements in Latin America. For the colonists, the victory was more than just political. It was deeply personal. Farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and ordinary families had stood against the greatest empire of their time and won. Against impossible odds, they reshaped history. The American Revolution wasn't just about independence. independence. It was about proving that ideals like freedom, representation, and self-rule could survive on the battlefield, and those ideals would go on to inspire generations around the world. Conclusion. The American Revolution began as a desperate gamble, ordinary colonists defying the world's most powerful empire. Yet through resilience, sacrifice, and a belief in something greater than themselves, they achieved the impossible. From the protests in Boston to the surrender at Yorktown, the story of independence wasn't just about battles, it was about ideas. Ideas that governments must serve the people, that freedom is worth fighting for, and that a new kind of nation could be built on those principles. More than 2 centuries later, the echoes of that revolution still shape our world. Every democracy, every struggle for self-determination carries a piece of that legacy. And it all began with one shot, fired in a small town in Massachusetts, that changed the course of history forever. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the American Revolution, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next untold story from history. Which moment surprised you the most? Lexington, Saratoga, or Yorktown? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about the choices that shaped our world and the lessons we can carry into the future. Until next time, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.